Back in 2012, the sudden death of Whitney Houston shook the music industry and shattered fans across the world. To most people, the story seemed to end with a headline and a cause of death. But inside the Beverly Hilton Hotel, where everything actually happened, witnesses say it never felt that simple. In early February 2012, Whitney Houston checked into the Beverly Hilton as a VIP guest, a global icon preparing for Grammy weekend. According to official reports, she would die there on February 11 in a hotel bathtub, her passing labeled a tragic accident. On paper, the narrative was clean. But the people who walked those halls, answered those phones, and stood outside her door remember something else: nearly 48 hours in which Whitney Houston was still alive, still moving, still speaking, and slowly coming apart behind a locked door that nobody was allowed to open. Hotel staff later claimed they noticed things that didn't match the neat timeline in the final report. They say they saw behavior that made them pause, heard sounds that didn't fit, and even smelled things that never appeared in any official document. When they asked questions, they say the message was clear: don't. This documentary reopens that corridor of time, the last 2 days of Whitney Houston's life, through the eyes of the people who were close enough to hear the water running, close enough to hear the music stop, but not close enough to step inside. Because if this really was only an accident, why do so many details from that room still feel like they've been left in the dark? Chapter 1. Day 1. The signs nobody acted on. February 9, 2012. Whitney Houston's final hours don't begin with sirens, flashing lights, or emergency calls. They start quietly on Thursday, February 9, 2012, inside a hotel suite that would soon be sealed off from the world. By late morning that day, staff working the floor say they already sensed something was off. According to housekeepers and front desk workers, Whitney was drifting in and out of her suite at strange intervals. She didn't follow a simple pattern of rest and activity. One moment she looked charged with nervous energy, moving quickly and talking. The next, she seemed drained, her shoulders low, her focus slipping. When she spoke, her sentences didn't always land cleanly. Employees later recalled how she would start clearly, then let the words trail away like a thought had dropped out of her hand midstream. There was no shouting, no collapse, nothing dramatic enough to trigger protocol, just a subtle inconsistency that made people uneasy without giving them anything concrete to report. The hallway outside her suite carried sound like a thin wire. Music poured out at volumes the staff described as unusually loud for daytime. Songs played for long stretches, then cut off abruptly, the silence almost as jarring as the noise. Minutes later, the music would slam back on again. On the door handle, a single object never moved: the Do Not Disturb sign. It stayed there most of the day, a small piece of plastic with the power to keep everyone on the other side. Housekeepers were instructed not to enter. One staff member assigned to that floor said they knocked once earlier than usual, and when no one answered, they did what they were trained to do: they stopped. No forced entry. No escalation. This was a high-profile guest. Privacy was the rule. Later that afternoon, Whitney appeared briefly at the front desk. A clerk who saw her described her as tired but polite, her voice soft, her presence almost fragile. Her movements were slow and deliberate. She asked a simple question, then moments later asked it again, as if unsure she'd been heard the first time or had already forgotten the answer. There was no scene, no complaint, just a quiet sense that something wasn't lining up. Security officers on duty that day also remember seeing her on the floor. She paced short distances, walking a few steps down the hall, turning back, then stopping like she wanted to keep moving, but didn't know where to go. One guard later described her as restless, not out of control. It looked, he said, like someone trying to burn off nerves, not someone in obvious medical danger. And that is exactly why nothing happened. Throughout February 9, the Whitney remained locked inside her suite for long stretches. Calls came in and went out. Music kept cycling in the background. The Do Not Disturb sign never moved. From the hallway, it looked like isolation by choice, a famous artist pulling back from the chaos of Grammy week. What it felt like inside that room, no one truly knows. What we do know is what didn't happen. There was no wellness check requested, no medical visit logged, no mental health evaluation triggered by what staff had quietly noticed. Even though she appeared exhausted and inconsistent, Whitney was still upright, still speaking, still functioning well enough that no formal alarm was raised. The system built to respond to collapse simply did not know how or when to respond to a slow unraveling. As evening moved in, people working that floor remember the atmosphere around the suite changing. Between bursts of loud music, there were stretches of heavy stillness. Doors opened and closed down the hall. Footsteps echoed, then faded. One employee later recalled catching a strong scent near the door, described only as chemical or medicated. It lingered just long enough to be noticed, then disappeared. There was no complaint, no incident report. Another moment filed away in memory, but never written down. By nightfall, Whitney withdrew completely. The music still came and went in waves. The lights inside the room dimmed. The hallway grew quieter as guests settled in or went down to events. Security did their normal rounds and moved on. Nothing crossed the bright red line that would have forced action. And yet, looking back, almost every detail reads like a warning laid out in plain sight. This wasn't a hidden collapse. It was a visible decline that never fit neatly into any checklist. The most disturbing part of February 9 is not what happened. It's what didn't. No one was asked to formally assess her emotional state. No one documented her mental condition. No one stopped to ask whether the privacy she had requested had quietly tipped over into dangerous isolation. The hotel staff did exactly what they were trained to do: respect boundaries, follow rules, protect a VIP's space. And because Whitney Houston was still moving, still talking, still technically okay, the system assumed she was fine. But decline does not always scream. Sometimes it whispers through behavior that can be dismissed as stress or fatigue until the damage is already done. By the time that first day ended, Whitney Houston had already entered a dangerous place, a narrow zone where exhaustion, emotional strain, and isolation were feeding each other unnoticed in any official document. The signs were subtle. They were seen by multiple people, felt in passing, and then allowed to float away disconnected. February 9 closed without an emergency, without a report, without any intervention. Just a locked door at the end of a hallway. And behind that door, a woman whose unraveling was becoming harder to see until the moment it would be impossible to ignore. Chapter 2. The night before death, sound silence in a closed door, February 10-11, 2012. The second day of Whitney Houston's final 48 hours didn't open with chaos. It opened with routine, and it would end with a silence no one thought to question until it was far too late. By the evening of Friday, February 10, 2012, the Beverly Hilton was fully awake. Grammy weekend energy pulsed through the building. Elevators were packed. Lobbies buzzed. Music floated up from ballrooms and event spaces below. But on Whitney Houston's floor, staff would later say it felt like one room was drifting away from the rest of the hotel. Her suite. According to hotel employees who later spoke about that night, the first thing that stood out wasn't a scream or a crash. It was the sound of water. From early evening onward, a steady rush could be heard coming from inside Whitney's bathroom. Not once, repeatedly. The sound of water running, long stopping, then starting again later. Housekeeping staff heard it during hallway rounds. Security noticed it while doing their routine patrols. And yet no one knocked. The Do Not Disturb sign was still hanging on the door. Policy was clear. A VIP guest had requested privacy. Respecting that request wasn't just polite, it was procedure. As the night went on, other sounds began to bleed into the hallway. Short, sharp noises, something dropping, something striking tile, a brief impact followed by silence. No conversation followed. No laughter. No second voice. Staff members who were there later described those moments as oddly unsettling. Not because they were loud, but because they stood alone, isolated sounds, leaking from a room that otherwise felt sealed. No one else was logged entering. Hotel records showed no visitors cleared for her suite that evening. Whitney's assistant stayed in contact only by phone. Those calls, according to reports, were short. There were no requests for housekeeping, no room service orders, no calls for help. On paper, everything looked routine. From the outside, it appeared like pure solitude, a famous woman choosing to shut out the noise. What was happening inside that decision, no one on the staff could see. Family members later said that when they spoke with Whitney that night, she sounded exhausted. Not wildly intoxicated, not incoherent, just drained. One relative remembered her saying she wasn't feeling right. Another recalled her admitting she wasn't okay without going into detail. These weren't 911 calls. They weren't desperate pleas. They were quiet admissions of depletion, and depletion, unlike collapse, doesn't trigger alarms. Between 10:00 p.m. and midnight, traffic in the hallway thinned out. Guests were either downstairs at events or behind their own closed doors. The hotel settled into late-night rhythm. Security continued passing through on schedule. They heard the water again, long enough to remember. Not quite alarming enough in their training to override a do not disturb sign for a celebrity guest. In a luxury hotel during a packed event weekend, strange noises are common. The context softened concern. Sometime after midnight, the corridor outside Whitney's suite went completely still. The music that had occasionally seeped through earlier could no longer be heard. Lights glowed faintly behind the curtains. The sign on the door remained in place. No one from inside called out. No service requests were logged. This is the point where her isolation became absolute. What happened in the hours between that silence and the moment she was found has never been laid out in full official detail. The coroner's report does not describe Whitney Houston's emotional state during the night. No medical file explains how she spent those final hours behind the locked door. Instead, there's a gap, a stretch of time where the most critical information, what she was feeling, thinking, doing, simply doesn't exist on paper. All that survives are fragments. One security guard later recalled stopping outside her door during a routine walkthrough and listening. No conversation, no TV, just the faint, distant impression of water again. Another staff member remembered pausing, hand hovering near the phone, as if considering whether to escalate, then walking on. Nothing in their training manual told them to act without a direct complaint or clear emergency. Around 2:00 a.m., internal hotel activity logs reportedly show no disturbances from that floor, no noise complaints, no requests involving Whitney's suite. On the system level, nothing had gone wrong. From the hotel's perspective, the night passed without incident. From a human perspective, it didn't. Whitney Houston spent that night alone. She wasn't under observation. No medical staff was monitoring her. No one was charting her fatigue, her emotional strain, or the physical toll of years of stress and substance issues. The people who loved her most were not physically present, and the structures meant to protect her privacy also ensured her isolation. Later, those closest to her would recognize the pattern. When overwhelmed, Whitney often pulled away. When pressure built, she disappeared behind closed doors. That night fit the pattern perfectly. But patterns don't stop outcomes. As morning approached on Saturday, February 11, staff coming on shift saw nothing on the surface that screamed emergency. The hallway was quiet. The do not disturb sign still hung where it had been the day before. No one had requested a wellness check. The night had ended without spectacle. And that is the most chilling detail. There were no cries that echoed through the building, no frantic calls from inside the room, no visible struggle unfolding in front of witnesses. The hotel absorbed whatever was happening behind that bathroom door and left almost no trace but the memory of running water, unusual stillness, and a feeling that something wasn't right. When the official timeline was written later, those hours were compressed into a few neutral lines. No emotional language, no behavioral analysis, just time stripped of texture. But for the people who were actually there, the unease never faded. They remembered the sounds. They remembered the water. They remembered how cut off that one room felt from everything else. The tragedy of that night is how normal it looked from the outside. Whitney Houston did not collapse in a crowded hallway. She did not publicly break down in front of cameras or staff. She stayed just functional enough for the system to leave her alone, and alone long enough that no one saw what she was losing. By the time morning came and the hotel resumed its usual rhythm, guests dressing for events, elevators filling up, staff resetting for another high-profile day behind one locked door, the end of a hallway, the countdown had already finished. This chapter doesn't end with the moment she was found. It ends with what never happened: no intervention, no interruption, no one deciding that silence was dangerous instead of polite. The night before Whitney Houston's death did not look like a crisis. It looked like quiet. And sometimes quiet is the most dangerous sound in the building. Chapter 3. The morning that ended everything. February 11, 2012. Saturday, February 11, 2012, started like any other high-profile Grammy weekend at the Beverly Hilton. Downstairs, the building was already in performance mode. Staff pressed uniforms, checked clipboards, and reset conference rooms. Guests floated through the lobby in designer clothes and dark sunglasses, rehearsing smiles for the cameras. From the outside, the hotel looked perfectly in sync. A few floors up, one room had already fallen out of rhythm. Inside Whitney Houston's suite, the morning played out very differently. According to later accounts, Whitney missed a set of expected plans late that morning. Calls that should have been routine went unanswered. The music that had been heard on and off the night before was now completely gone. The Do Not Disturb sign remained on the door like it had been glued there. No housekeeping, no room service, no movement anyone could clearly track. Around 11:00 a.m., concern finally crossed a threshold. Whitney's longtime assistant, Mary Jones, tried reaching her again. Still nothing. On its own, a missed call from Whitney wasn't unheard of. She often slept late, especially before big events. But this time the silence felt different. Too still. Too complete. Mary Jones went up to the suite this time with hotel security beside her. When the door was opened, the air inside told its own story. The room was unusually quiet for a space that had been full of sound just the day before. Curtains were mostly drawn. Light filtered in weakly around the edges. The air felt heavy, like it had been sitting still for hours. Furniture was in place. Nothing screamed chaos. Yet the entire room felt wrong. Mary called Whitney's name. No answer. They moved farther into the suite toward the bathroom. The door was locked. From inside there was no voice, no movement, but there had been water. Some accounts say the sound of running water was heard, or that it was clear the tub had been recently filled. Mary knocked harder. She called Whitney's name again, louder, her voice cutting through the quiet. There was still no response. At that point, protocol changed. Privacy no longer outweighed danger. Hotel security forced the bathroom door open. What they saw inside froze the room. Whitney Houston was face down in the bathtub, submerged, unresponsive. The water remained in the tub. For a second, no one moved. It didn't feel real, not because they didn't know who she was, but because the scene didn't match the normal rhythm of an emergency. There had been no build-up, no visible escalation in the hallway, just an ordinary morning and then this. Seconds later, training kicked in. Security called for emergency assistance. CPR was started. Mary reportedly screamed for help. Radios lit up. Instructions flew through the air. Doors along the hallway cracked open as staff were redirected or pushed back. It was just before noon. Paramedics arrived within minutes. They continued resuscitation efforts inside the suite. The bathroom that had been an intensely private space, a sealed-off world for one of the most famous singers on earth, became crowded with responders, security, and staff. Medical equipment replaced toiletries. Commands replaced music. Seconds replaced small talk. Whitney Houston was later pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center that afternoon. But for the people who were actually there, what haunts them most are the minutes around that discovery, the narrow slice of time between concern and confirmation. Several hotel workers would later describe a shift that happened almost immediately after the door was opened. The mood moved from chaos to control in a matter of moments. Hallways were cleared. Access was tightened. Staff were ordered away from the area. Some were told directly to return to their posts and act as though nothing had happened. One employee recalled the tone more than the exact words, the sense that a curtain had dropped. Not just over the bathroom, but over the story of what they had seen and heard. Official timelines would eventually reconstruct the morning in neutral language discovery. Emergency call. Response. Transport. Pronouncement. What those timelines cannot capture is the emotional whiplash. Whitney had been alive the night before. Staff had heard the water. They had walked past that door dozens of times. Then, in what felt like a single shattering moment, she was gone. Mary Jones would later say she believed Whitney had been preparing to leave the hotel that day. They'd discussed plans. There was an expectation of movement, of getting ready, of showing up. That assumption that Whitney was resting, that there was still plenty of time, helped delay urgency. Security officers who responded to the suite described the scene as surreal. One minute they were performing a standard welfare check. The next they were standing in the bathroom of one of the most recognizable voices in the world, realizing they were too late. Then came the instructions, not about how to feel, but about what not to say. Staff were reminded of confidentiality. They were told not to speak to the press. Questions about what they'd seen, heard, or smelled were quietly redirected. Internal conversations were discouraged. The suite was sealed. The story from their level was over. Outside, the hotel news broke at high speed. Cameras lined the perimeter. Fans gathered in shock. Statements were drafted. Tributes began almost instantly. Inside, staff kept working. They checked in new guests, answered phones, delivered room service. They smiled on cue, all while carrying images they couldn't talk about, details they weren't sure they were allowed to share, and questions no one had officially asked them. The hardest piece of that morning to reconcile is how close intervention came and how easily it slipped past. What if someone had entered earlier? What if the unusual sounds and long-running water had triggered a midnight wellness check? What if silence had been treated as a warning instead of a courtesy? No official document can answer those questions. The coroner's report would focus instead on substances, organs, and timing, the mechanics of death. It could not speak to the long, quiet lead-up that left Whitney alone in that bathroom unseen until there was nothing left to save. The morning of February 11 stands as a narrow hallway between two realities: the world downstairs moving through a normal Grammy weekend, and a locked door upstairs, where the story had already reached its ending. Whitney Houston didn't disappear in a crowd. She disappeared in isolation. In a room no one felt authorized to enter. In a system that didn't move until someone finally decided the silence had lasted too long. By the time that decision was made, the outcome was already fixed. Chapter 4. After the discovery orders, no one ever wrote down. What happened after Whitney Houston was found in that bathroom did not look like a hotel spiraling into chaos. It looked like a hotel shifting into control. On Saturday, February 11, 2012, just moments after emergency responders were called to Whitney's suite, the Beverly Hilton quietly changed gears. To the guests gathered downstairs for Grammy weekend, nothing looked out of place. Drinks were poured. Conversations flowed. The lobby kept its polished calm. But upstairs on the floor where Whitney had been staying, everything tightened. Within minutes, security sealed off the hallway near her room. Elevators were rerouted or restricted. Staff without direct authorization were steered away from the area, sometimes without being told exactly why. Radios clipped at belts, switched to shorter codes, quieter exchanges. According to several hotel employees who later spoke about that day in private, the shift was unmistakable. What began as a medical emergency quickly became something else, a containment effort. Whitney Houston's suite turned into a restricted zone. Employees who had been closest to the scene were told to move back. Some were escorted to other floors. Others were simply told to resume their normal duties as if nothing out of the ordinary had just happened. One staff member later recalled the kind of instruction that lingers more in tone than in exact words, something like, "You didn't see anything. You didn't hear anything. There were no official briefings in writing, no memos passed out, just verbal directives moving from supervisor to staff, fast and undocumented. Outside the hotel, the world had already begun to close in. Reports say media organizations moved quickly once news leaked, sending crews to the Beverly Hilton within hours. Inside, security and management coordinated to keep reporters and cameras away from the upper floors. Curtains were drawn tighter. Windows stayed closed. Access points narrowed. Employees later said that inside the building, confusion floated beneath the surface. Some staff members expected to be interviewed in detail about what they had seen or heard the night before: the sounds of water, the patterns of noise and silence, the unusual length of her isolation. But according to those accounts, many were never asked for full statements. No one sat them down to reconstruct their timelines. If an observation hadn't already been written into a formal log, it often stayed where it started, in memory, not on paper. "We were told to follow procedure," one staff member reportedly said years later. And procedure meant not talking. The phrase "follow procedure" appears again and again in those recollections. Yet what that procedure covered and what it left out was never fully explained to the people closest to the scene. One of the most debated pieces of that morning is the exact timeline between the first moment of concern and the full emergency response. Official records list when 911 was called and when paramedics arrived. What they don't clearly spell out, at least in public, is the sequence inside the suite. How many minutes passed between the first knock on the bathroom door and the decision to break it open? How long was CPR attempted before paramedics took over? Employees who were nearby described those moments as blurry, compressed under the weight of authority and shock. Orders came quickly. Questions didn't. The priority was movement, not reflection. When official reports were later released, some details that staff found memorable seemed to disappear. The coroner's summary focused tightly on the physical scene and cause of death: the bathtub, the drowning, the substances. There was little mention of the long-running water the night before, the repeated "do not disturb" sign, or the lingering sense that the suite had felt cut off from the rest of the building. Those details were not publicly contradicted. They were simply left out. Medically, the paperwork did what it was designed to do: list injuries, substances, mechanisms. But context, the environment, the behavior, the small choices that could have changed the outcome, lived outside those pages. For employees who had been on that floor, the omission felt deliberate, whether or not it actually was. In the hours after Whitney's death, verbal reminders about non-disclosure and confidentiality circulated among staff. People were warned about talking to anyone outside official channels. Legal language was referenced. Contracts were implied. One supervisor, according to a later account, said, "This will be handled above us." The message was simple: this story wasn't theirs to tell. By late afternoon, Whitney Houston had been pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center. Outside, the news cycle exploded. Fans gathered. Reporters filed live shots. Tributes began rolling out from every corner of the industry. Inside, the hotel had to keep functioning. Staff clocked in and out. Other rooms were cleaned. Event spaces were reset. Guests who knew nothing of what had happened still expected flawless service. The suite Whitney left behind remained sealed, guarded, and untouched, except by those officially cleared to enter. For the employees who had seen the hallway, heard the orders, or stood near the door in those final days, the split was jarring. Outwardly, everything went back to normal. Internally, they were replaying the same images, the same unanswered questions. In the days that followed, official narratives solidified. The cause of death was public. The toxicology breakdown arrived later. Press statements framed the story. What never appeared in public records were the emotional margins, no formal explanation of why the isolation wasn't interrupted sooner, no acknowledgement of the staff's unease, no attempt to reconcile their impressions with the clean lines of the written timeline. Some employees admitted years later that they questioned those gaps in private, but never felt safe raising them in public. To talk meant potentially risking their jobs, their reputation, or legal trouble. Silence was the safest option. Looking back, some say the most unsettling part of that day wasn't the emergency. It was how quickly everything moved from response to erasure. Not destroying evidence, not denying facts, just quietly excluding anything that made the story messier, less controllable, harder to digest. This chapter isn't about accusing a hotel or rewriting investigative files from scratch. It's about recognizing how power handles moments like this, how narratives get simplified not necessarily because the more complicated version is false, but because it's inconvenient. Whitney Houston's death became a worldwide headline in a matter of hours. But for the staff who stood in that hallway, heard the water, saw the lockdown, and later listened to a flat, polished version of events on the news, one truth remains. The most revealing parts of the story might be the ones no one was ever asked to write down. Chapter 5. The official conclusion and the questions that kept moving. The official answer arrived on March 22, 2012, wrapped in medical terms and legal certainty. For many, it was the closing line. For others, it was the beginning of a different kind of unease. The Los Angeles County Coroner's Office released its findings. Whitney Houston, 48, had died from accidental drowning. Contributing factors included heart disease and recent cocaine use. The place of death, the bathtub in her Beverly Hilton suite, where she'd been discovered on February 11. On paper, it made sense. A tragic accident. A familiar pattern addiction, stress a vulnerable body pushed too far. The narrative fit a box the public already understood. But for those who studied the case more closely, or who had been physically there in those last 2 days, the neatness of the conclusion felt at odds with what they remembered. The first unresolved piece was time. Whitney had been alone for a long stretch before she was found. Hotel logs and witness accounts suggest that hours passed without anyone entering her room. No overnight wellness check was performed. No doctor was called to examine her during that window, even though her history with substances, stress, and exhaustion was no secret. For a woman in her condition, the absence of any early intervention was stark. The second unresolved piece was silence. Various hotel workers later described hearing water running for unusually long periods, isolated noises, and an eerie stillness between those sounds on the night before her death. Those impressions never made it into the coroner's final summary. Not because they were disproven, but because medical reports are built to answer a narrower question: what killed her, not how long she was alone before it happened. Yet it's in that context where prevention lives. The third problem was inconsistency. People who had seen or spoken with Whitney in those last 48 hours remembered her differently. Staff described her as restless, one moment drained the next. Family recalled exhaustion admissions that she wasn't feeling right. Some heard music and movement. Others remembered only silence. These discrepancies weren't enormous, but they mattered. They painted a picture of a woman fluctuating between functioning and fading, a pattern of decline, not a single sharp fall. In the official story, those conflicting impressions were streamlined into a single smooth timeline. The texture vanished. The fourth missing piece was psychological. The autopsy carefully documented her physical condition, heart disease, substances, physiology, but it said nothing about her mental state in the last 24 to 48 hours. No mention of isolation, no discussion of emotional overload, no attempt to map her exhaustion or track the subtle signs of someone nearing a breaking point. Once the body provided an answer, the mind was treated as almost irrelevant. But Whitney wasn't just a set of lab values. She was a person navigating years of pressure, trauma, and public scrutiny, all while trying to stay standing in a world that wouldn't stop watching her. The official conclusion explained how she died. It did not explain why she was alone in that room, unchecked, unmonitored, and unprotected, until it was too late. Then something happened that made those old questions echo louder. On January 31, 2015, almost 3 years later, Whitney's daughter, Bobby Christina Brown, was found unresponsive in a bathtub at her home in Roswell, Georgia. She had been alone. There were substances involved. She was taken to the hospital and never woke up. She died on July 26, 2015, after months in a coma. 2 scenes, 2 bathtubs, 2 long isolated stretches of time. Officially, the cases were handled separately. Different locations, different circumstances, different legal outcomes. But emotionally, for many people watching, they fused into one devastating pattern, a family line haunted by addiction, unresolved pain, and moments where intervention arrived too late to matter. For some, Bobby Christina's story reopened the cracks in Whitney's case. You could hear the questions form. Was isolation underestimated again? Were early warning signs dismissed as just how they are under stress? Did privacy once more take priority over protection? None of those questions directly accuse a single person. They interrogate the systems around them, hotels, households, industries, systems that jump into action once someone collapses, but often do nothing as long as that person is still standing still, breathing still, saying, "I'm fine," when they're anything but. Whitney Houston's death has often been framed as an inevitable tragedy, the sad, predictable ending to a story we think we already know. But inevitability is a dangerous word. It quietly erases all the points where something could have been done differently. She did not vanish in an instant. She moved through nearly 2 full days of visible strain, erratic behavior, and mounting isolation. Multiple people noticed that something was wrong. None of them were in a position or felt empowered to trigger a real intervention. The coroner's report answered the question, what killed her? It never addressed the harder one. Why did help come so late? And perhaps the most painful truth is this: nothing in the final medical conclusion disproves the idea that Whitney Houston's death might have been preventable. It simply doesn't address that possibility at all. On paper, the case is closed. In reality, the unanswered questions kept moving, from staff who worked that floor to fans to anyone who hears her voice and wonders how a person so powerful on stage could be so unprotected when it mattered most. Whitney Houston did not just die in a bathtub. She died inside a system that notices collapse, not decline, a world that steps forward for the emergency, but often looks away from the slow unraveling that leads up to it. Outro. For years, Whitney Houston's death has been labeled a tragic accident. But when you step back and look closely at those final 48 hours, the isolation, the missed signs, the staff unease, the silence that kept being mistaken for peace, it becomes harder to believe this was only fate. It starts to look like something else, a preventable tragedy that no one stopped in time. So now it turns to you. Do you believe what happened to Whitney was an unavoidable accident, or do you see a chain of failures, human, structural, systemic, that could have broken at any point and didn't? Which detail from her final 48 hours unsettles you the most? The water, the locked door, the silence, or the speed with which the story was cleaned up for public consumption? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more investigations that reopen the stories we think we already understand, stay with us. Some truths don't disappear. They just wait behind closed doors until someone is willing to look again. If you know someone whose life or person